Welcome, intrepid historians. So the French and Indian War was well underway. Meanwhile, Britain invites most of the colonies to a meeting in Albany, New York. This meeting is called the Albany Congress, and the purpose is to coordinate efforts among the colonies so they can fight a successful war against France. There are a couple of important issues. One is the Iroquois. Now, the Iroquois League was an alliance of these 5 native nations, these 5 Indian tribes, the so-called 5 nations, working together as the Iroquois League. They dominated what is now upstate New York. And while nearly all natives in North America sided with the French, the English, the British had maintained a reasonably good relationship with the Iroquois League, and Britain and the colonies recognized that they needed to keep the Iroquois League on the British side if they were going to have any hope of winning this war. Right? The 5 nations are so close to population centers in Albany and New York, New York City, and eastern Pennsylvania, that it would have been a disaster for the British. And the good news about the Albany Congress is they do come up with a plan, and they execute the plan, and they keep the Iroquois League mostly on the British side throughout the war. So that makes victory possible, and in that sense, the Albany Congress is successful. The more difficult task in the Albany Congress is getting the colonies to coordinate the war effort in general. Now, this is Ben Franklin around the time of the Albany Congress, and he has an idea for how the colonies can work together successfully. He calls it the Albany Plan of Union. Franklin's argument is that if each colony tries to fight a separate war against France, it's going to be a failure. It's going to be a disaster. And what Franklin proposes is an additional layer of government, a sort of government of the United Colonies, an intercolonial government. Every colony would send representatives to this government, and that this sort of central colonial government would coordinate the war effort, distribute the financial burden of the war among the different colonies. So each of the colonies would tax folks and provide their fair share of the war effort. Each of the 13 colonies would raise troops and contribute troops to this centralized and organized, coordinated war effort. This was Franklin's proposal. A lot of people at the Albany Congress agreed, thought this was a great idea, but didn't feel like they had enough power to adopt it. So they're taking the plan back to their respective colonies. And all 13, Franklin is not just pitching the plan here at the Albany Congress, he's also pushing it out to the public through his newspapers. This is a political cartoon that he developed, making a simple argument for why the Albany Plan of Union is necessary. The colonies need to join together in this war or they're going to die. Here, the head of the snake is New England, and then you have New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania and Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia, too small in terms of population to rate in Franklin's radar, and not a lot of people are reading newspapers in Georgia either. Anyhow, so this plan is pitched to all 13 colonies, and all 13 colonies reject it. They're like, we don't want to do this. What's going on? Well, colonial politicians know that colonists don't like paying taxes, and so they're basically afraid to approve a plan that would result in people paying more taxes during wartime. And so Franklin throws a Hail Mary. He's like, he pitches this plan to Parliament, not in person. He's in America right now. He'll be over in Britain shortly, but right now he's in the colonies. But he asked Parliament, hey, Parliament, you could make us do it. And Parliament has no appetite for that. Parliament does not want to force on the 13 colonies something that 13 colonies have already rejected. And so the Franklin's Albany Plan of Union is rejected, not implemented, and this turns out to be a disaster for the 13 colonies. They're going to fail in all the ways that Franklin predicted by having an uncoordinated war effort. The global war is called the 7 Years' War. So in other countries, when they're learning about this war, they call it the 7 Years' War, and the French and Indian War is just the North American manifestation of that. We're focused on American history now, so for us it's the French and Indian War. Anyhow, what's going on in North America? Well, at first, it's not all bad in North America. The French Navy lands in force and conquers this area called Acadia, which contained like more than, something like 12,000 French settlers. And, the British decide that's a problem, and so they deport most of those French settlers. More than 10,000 of them are deported, and many of them find their way to Louisiana. That's postal code for Louisiana. And over time, the pronunciation of Acadian, people from Acadia, becomes Cajuns. So the Cajun culture of Louisiana is a result of these Acadian refugees expelled from their homeland here in what's now sort of Maine and Nova Scotia to ultimately land in Louisiana. So that was a victory for the British, but the rest of the news is pretty bad, right? So here's Washington's initial expedition, his defeat by the French that begins the war, and here is General Braddock heading for the Battle of Monongahela, right? So, still going after Fort Duquesne, basically, trying to get control of the Ohio country. General Braddock is a British general, and he is leading a larger force with help from George Washington. Washington had quit the Virginia militia to avoid demotion, but he is trying to rehabilitate his reputation, so he volunteers to serve as a military aide to General Braddock. Now, he's not going to get paid. He doesn't have a rank, but being a volunteer military aide gives him a chance to function as an officer and maybe improve his reputation after the humiliation of Fort Necessity. Braddock, it's a good deal for him because Washington obviously was, just there, the previous year, and has some intelligence. Unfortunately, Braddock doesn't have intelligence in either sense of the word. He largely ignores Washington's advice and the advice of other old hands in the area. One bit of advice they gave General Braddock is, while most of the Indians are siding with the French, there are some Indians who liked the British and we could use their help. And General Braddock was like, absolutely not. Those Indians are savages. Sooner or later we're going to kill them all and take all their land. We don't need their help now. And the other bit of advice that Washington and others gave General Braddock is that fighting in the woods is different. This is not like a European battlefield where we march in neat rows and meet on a level field. Washington and others warned General Braddock that the French fight like the Indians. Obviously the Indians fight like Indians too, right? They're sniping from behind trees, taking advantage of the terrain and vegetation. Braddock, and they urged Braddock, therefore, that British forces needed to adopt similar tactics or they were going to lose in wilderness battles. Braddock's like, that's ridiculous. We're going to fight like Englishmen. We're not going to fight in a cowardly and dishonorable way like the French and the Indians. And, well, as you might predict, things go badly at the Battle of Monongahela. This turns into a crushing defeat for the British. Now, what about Washington? Well, Washington is going into this battle with a major problem. He has been afflicted with a disease called dysentery. Now, dysentery is like, imagine the worst stomach flu you've ever had, um, and now imagine it being a lot worse than that. And instead of like normal diarrhea, you've got diarrhea with blood, and that's dysentery, right? So Washington was very sick. Probably shouldn't have even fought in this battle, but he was determined to repair his reputation. So even though he is violently ill, he saddles up and rides into battle and fights well. At one point, his horse is shot out from under him, and he keeps fighting, gets another horse, rides back into battle. That horse is shot out from under him as well. After the battle, he finds 4 bullet holes in his coat, so many close calls in the battle. But best of all, Washington, acquits himself, shows great courage, is one of the few British folks to fight well in this battle. Like the French and Indians so overwhelmed the British that even British regulars who were normally disciplined did not do well. And Washington by now has evolved into, pretty rapidly, into a compelling leader of men, and at least the section of the Virginia militia that he was charged with leading fought well in retreat. I mean, don't get me wrong, Battle of Monongahela is a disaster for the British. British take heavy casualties, but whereas a lot of other British regulars and militia forces fled in disorder, Washington held his unit together, and they fought an orderly and effective retreat. Now, getting back to Virginia, since so many British officers had been slain in the battle, Washington was expecting to be offered one of the vacant officer roles because he had fought so well at Monongahela, but was disappointed when all of those vacant officer positions went to British people who were born in Britain. Washington knew this was unfair. He knew that he was more qualified and more proven in battle than a lot of the guys who got those jobs. He believes he's being discriminated against because he is a colonist rather than a British person from Britain, and he's right. That is exactly what's happening. He does land on his feet, however. The Virginia militia, seeing how well he did, offer him not his old job back. They offer him a promotion, and Washington gets to serve, the rest of the war. Eventually rises to the rank of brigadier general. So he does very well personally, but does feel burned by the experience. Now, the Battle of Monongahela is in every history textbook I have ever seen, and the Battle of Monongahela is a fascinating incident, but it's most useful for evaluating the character of George Washington. It's less good as a guide to the war, because the Battle of Monongahela is bizarre, right? In most of the war, colonial militia are useless and British troops are effective. This is the conclusion that Washington himself comes to in the course of the war. But this bizarre outlier, this one weird case where some colonial militia fought better than British troops, sort of stuck in the mind of the colonists and created for the colonists a myth that they had fought bravely in the French and Indian War and the British had been useless. Now, we're going to see that, in fact, the opposite was true, that colonial militia were pretty useless and that British forces were consistently effective. Also leadership. In this case, General Braddock was a fool, but most British officers were actually pretty effective. So more on that in part 2.